A while back we posted a video on YouTube as a response to a defense we saw versus a hook punch. And lo and behold, someone responded to us. The originator of that response made some good points regarding technique and our technique, and then provided a technique of his own. So in the spirit of continuing the dialogue, we thought we would respond to his response. And when we're doing that, we thought we probably might want to start by making clear some of the assumptions under which we're operating. No matter what, whenever we're demonstrating any technique or doing anything in a class situation, we have to make assumptions. Okay? Every single time, there are certain things we assume is true about the situation or our attacker. And sometimes our assumptions are unconscious. We need to make very sure that we are not assuming things that are not true. For example, in this particular case, our initial response was for a women's self-defense situation. And there are certain assumptions that we have to make for women's self-defense that are different from a general martial arts class. Specifically, if I'm teaching a class and I have certain techniques that work for me, just because they work for me doesn't necessarily mean they're going to work for someone who's smaller than I am. I'm not the biggest person in the world, but I outweigh her by a good 70 pounds, and I'm taller. Therefore, techniques that I assume work for everyone may not necessarily, depending on how they generate power or how they affect the other person or the angle at which we're applying them. So we have to watch that sort of thing. In particular, often teachers kind of need some reality checks periodically because many teachers have never had experience outside of the practice hall applying any of the techniques. Because of this, sometimes our assumptions kind of wander off into fantasy land. Now, when I say that, I mean teachers in general. The good teachers are the ones who continually try and take a look at what they're doing, see what assumptions they're operating under, and seeing if what they're doing makes any sense with respect to reality. And having their students take a look at that too is a good thing. One of the reasons we started this series of responses is so that I could get my students, one of the reasons I started, is so I could get my students to start looking at techniques in a critical fashion, not critiquing them in a derogatory fashion or saying our art's better than theirs, but in the idea that every technique out there can be analyzed in terms of its effectiveness, specifically not only for just one person, but its effectiveness for a range of people. Certain techniques are much easier if you're big, certain techniques are easier if you're small, if you're limber, if you're tall, etc. So what techniques are high percentage and work for everyone, and what don't work at all? So that's the point of view we're coming across from. In this case, the response is about women's self-defense. And for women's self-defense, there's certain assumptions we're making. In general, we're assuming that, obviously the defender is female. In general, most females are smaller in terms of both being shorter and weighing less. Generally have less upper body strength. So from a size perspective, they're smaller and lighter and less strong in terms of upper body. Second set of assumptions has to do with the fact that in women's self-defense versus martial arts, most of the time they haven't spent years and years in martial arts. High-level martial arts thinking and high-level movement in martial arts is not something that's going to be occurring in most women's self-defense. People who take women's self-defense sometimes take a 3-hour seminar. If they're lucky, they do a 2-month class where they meet 5 to 10 times. That's it. As such, we need simple gross body movement techniques that work for everybody almost instantaneously. Now, if there were a class of techniques that fit that criterion, everybody would have it, and the martial arts would be the best in the world because they'd always work. They don't. However, so we need to pick from the set of techniques that's available, ones that are the most high percentage that we can actually think of. So, for someone like her, the initial response was versus a hook punch. So, a larger attacker sits here, steps forward and hook punches, she steps into it and blocks it with both arms. Okay. This time I'm going to strike faster, she's going to actually do the block. Okay. Now, you'll see when I did that, you notice she rocked backward slightly. This time I'm going to strike a lot harder, and unfortunately she has permission to strike me a lot harder too. So, you know, smile on her face. She's going to step forward, hammering in with the block. I, on the other hand, am going to put my whole body behind the strike, and we'll see what happens. Ready? Here we go. Okay. So, you look at what happened. My arm was stopped. Believe me, I didn't stop it by myself. Nonetheless, what happened to her balance? She was arced back and brought backwards, but she wasn't hit in the head. The person who responded to our initial technique, we're living in a fun area here. The person who responded to our initial technique made the cogent point that if the person striking is much bigger, this person might still be bowled over. And obviously that's true. Now, she's had exactly 5 repetitions of this technique to learn it. So someone in a women's self-defense class would actually have more practice and put more force forward. Nonetheless, a suitably large person could possibly collapse their block and cause them to be crunched backwards. So that's a very important point. We're making the assumption that this guy isn't so big he can bowl him over. Well, maybe they are. Okay? On the other hand, if a smaller person's hitting me, she hits it in the same sort of thing, it's relatively easy for me to knock her backwards and then do whatever. So if the teacher is bigger and used to being bigger, or the same size but has a lot more practice, they might make the assumption that, oh yeah, this will always work. Not necessarily. That being said, what we have to think about is how high percentage is this? High percentage being defined as how often will it work versus the majority of attackers out there. Because in a women's self-defense class, we have a limited amount of time. We cannot teach all the techniques that someone may have to use sometime in their life. We have to teach the few techniques that they can learn and learn quickly enough to be effective at that will be the best reactions to the largest range of situations we can, even knowing that we're not going to be able to teach them everything they might need to know. So, is it high percentage? Will it work most of the time against most of the people? This particular situation tends to work fairly well as long as one important thing happens. Okay? If they step in and drive their body and block, this force may bowl them over, but it won't hit them in the head. Okay? Chances are it won't actually bowl them over because in the middle of falling, they're going to grab the arm and retain their space and retain their balance without falling. Now, they're going to be rocked backwards, but they won't have fallen and they will have struck the other person's arm and frozen it for a half a second. A fairly decent outcome. There's one important assumption we are making, and that is that someone who's trained only for 5 hours or so, it can be trained to step forward versus a committed attacker. That's a far-fetched assumption. Think about it. If she's sitting here and this person is an actual attacker, okay, they're acting fierce, they're really going to hurt this person, they've made verbal threats, they're yelling, they're screaming, whatever, in a real self-defense situation, this person does this, most people go and they freeze or they flinch back. Now, is it possible within 5 classes or so to train people to immediately drive forward? Yes, it is. Is that a high percentage possibility? Depends on how realistic your training is. If your training doesn't involve scenario training or adrenaline-based scenarios in some fashion, chances are when the adrenaline really comes up and someone really comes at them, they're going to freeze. And that makes this technique not happen. Because the point of our original video is, if this person doesn't step in, if I just swing at them and they raise their hands out, so I'm going to swing and split my hands out. Ready? I do this, it definitely is going to bowl it over. They have to step in and make it worthwhile. So from that, this isn't actually the technique that I would teach if I had a 5-week self-defense class. Maybe in the next video I'll show the one that I would teach, which oddly enough is lower percentage in terms of its effectiveness, in terms of not getting hit, but it's much higher percentage in terms of the fact that most semi-trained people will actually do it, and it stops enough of the punch so that people don't get clocked in the head and that they can actually continue. That all being said, now we know where we're starting on the basis of assumptions. Women's self-defense, semi-trained people, limited amount of time, requiring high percentage techniques, and the person is normally smaller than the attacker. That's where we're starting from, and that's where we're going to go in our response to the hook punch defense that was shown to us.